up next, I actually have my co-host Lee Steinke, who is going to be helping me present our next speakers. Yes, that's 2 speakers, not just one. Lee, are you here?
Yes, sir.
Hi, Lee. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Pretty good. You look phenomenal, by the way.
Thank you. It's been a great conversation so far. So fun to listen to.
Very much so. So we're going to be presenting our next 2 speakers that are with us today. It is Laura Forczyk and Jared Zambrano Stout. Laura is actually Dr. Laura Forczyk, and she is the owner of space consulting firm Astralytical, specializing in space science, industry, and policy, and offering space career coaching services. She is a NASA subject matter expert for Planetary Science Missions and is also the primary author of Astralytical, Explore, Flybys, and Orbit Analytics. Dr. Forczyk is the author of Rise of the Space Age Millennials 2020 and is a frequent source for national news publications, major regional newspapers, and public radio. And we also have Jared Zambrano Stout. Mr. Stout is the Director of Congressional and Regulatory Policy at Meeks, Butera Israel, a Washington, D.C.-based law firm that specializes in legal representation and legislative regulatory advocacy before Congress, federal administrative and supervisory agencies, and the U.S. federal and local courts in the District of Columbia. Mr. Stout has extensive experience working with federal departments and agencies, as well as research, science, and technology development programs within the federal government. He advises clients on a wide array of interdisciplinary aerospace issues, including the civil, commercial, and national security space sectors. Hi, Laura, and hi, Jared. How are you today?
Hello, glad to be here.
Hi, Leo. Thanks for the introduction.
Yes, thank you so much. The screen is yours whenever you're ready to present.
Great. Well, I don't think Jared or I have slides, right, Jared?
No, I prefer conversations like this. I think, Laura, you do too, to be more interactive and discussive as opposed to just talking at people.
Definitely. So, Laura, we'll start with you.
Yeah. So to give you a little bit more background as to why I'm approaching this subject, my first full-time job out of graduate school was working for ISS National Lab, also called CASIS, the Center for the Advancement of Science and Space. For those who don't know, the International Space Station was designated a national lab by Congress in 2005. And that's when NASA set out to find a partner institution, a nonprofit, to handle International Space Station payloads for the benefit of humankind on Earth. So when you think about space station, you probably think about NASA and all the great things that NASA does with human space exploration. I love all of their missions going out, looking outward. But CASIS was specifically designed to look inward and figure out how we can benefit life on Earth so that we can use the space station platform for the citizens who are paying for it, essentially. And so that was the job that I was initially hired to do, was to look at both people who already knew ISS existed and help them get their payloads through the process to decide which payloads to fly, because we want a wide diversity of science on space station, but also reaching out to people who did not know that they could do science in space. So that would be, universities, small companies, large companies, and especially like the pharmaceutical companies. I worked on the physical sciences side because I'm a physicist, but we had such a small science team that I really helped out on the life sciences as well. So that's where I really got exposed to a lot of the fantastic work that's done on space station. And then from there, realized that this is an invaluable asset. And so when I was working at CASIS, we watched this movie called Gravity, which maybe you've seen. It's a little silly, but we actually went out as a team and watched this movie, and I began to realize that space station really has a finite life. And if we want to continue to have a presence in low Earth orbit with humans, then we need to plan for the future. And that has been made ever so clear the past year or so, that the astronauts and cosmonauts on space station have been looking for these leaks And you know, it's not in danger right now, but space station will come to a finite end. And right now, US law has it at 2024. No one thinks that space station is going to end in 2024. It'll be renewed to probably at least 2028, probably 2030 or more, but it has a finite end. So we need to start preparing for the future. And the future is not a big government space station, at least not NASA's government space station. It's looking ahead to commercial space stations. So that's kind of a very brief introduction there about what I want to talk about. Off to you, Jared.
Thanks, Laura. And thanks to the group for inviting me. I think when Michael first actually it was Laura that first contacted me, but when Michael reached out, I actually mentioned to him, I'm always happy to talk space with a captive audience. And I guess a webinar is probably about as captive as you get. So thanks very much for the invitation. I appreciate it. And Laura, thanks for working with me on it. So I guess the place that I'll start is my career on the Hill, on Capitol Hill. I started about 10 years ago. And I didn't actually expect to be in space policy. I usually tell people that I didn't find space policy found me. It was sort of a necessity of the member that I worked for at the time from Florida that represented the Space Coast. And it was right at the time that President Obama had decided to cancel the Constellation program, and Congress was kind of like working through that with the 2010 NASA authorization. At the same time that the planned decommissioning of the shuttle program was also happening. And so those two things sort of converged at the same point in time, and we ended up with a really devastating result for our space industrial base and our workforce throughout the country, but certainly in Florida. So space policy sort of became this huge deal to our office at the time when we didn't really, coming into, she was a new member, so coming into Congress, I don't think she thought this was going to be the top thing she'd have to deal with. And so I sort of built a reputation on trying to figure out how are we going to transition the Space Coast to something that looked very different than it had for, the last 50 years. And so when I think about the transition of the International Space Station and low Earth orbit, I really think a lot about that period in my life when we had it was somewhere on the order of 16,000 to 18,000 jobs that we lost on the Space Coast, and that those are second and third order effects, right? Like you're talking about waiters and waitresses and in restaurants that had to close down because nobody lived there anymore, or daycares that no longer had kids that needed to be cared for because the main caretakers weren't working. And so you have these like second and third order effects. I think when we talk about the transition of the space station, that's the thing that's in the forefront of my mind, is that we have this incredible workforce that is, private in the case of the sustainment contracts with ISS and Boeing and all of their subcontractors, as well as all of the public employees at NASA, at Johnson Space Center, that have all this incredible knowledge about how to live and work and operate in space. And if we lose the space station without having a plan for what happens next, without having all of these various pieces in place, what we're really going to have is a gap in low Earth orbit where we don't have private space stations that are up and ready and flying and prepared to service the needs of the country. We won't have any government programs that are capable of doing that. And so, when we look at what happened on the Space Coast, it's really just now that we're getting to the point where that workforce has really been built back up, for human spaceflight on the coast. We're getting to the point where Artemis is going to start flying. So we've got those jobs that are there and those capabilities and that workforce that's there. We've got SpaceX and ULA and Blue Origin and all these folks that are starting to get to the point where they're ready to fly people. And so I think what my biggest concern is, and probably will always be until we get to a point where we've got a solid transition, is how do we make sure that our country's national capabilities, whether those capabilities are private or they have a public component or however we decide to do that, how do we get to the point where we've got stable capability there for low Earth orbit? And there's a lot of different ways that we go about that. In the Trump administration, when I was the chief of staff for the National Space Council, one of the things that we did with Space Policy Directive 2 was we really wanted to force the streamlining of regulations so that the private industry had a lot more flexibility in launch and reentry. They had more flexibility in framework and stable regulations for things that were going on with like remote sensing and spectrum usage and our laws and regulations that deal with export controls. Like those things are sort of the starting building blocks from a policy perspective of how you put the pieces in place to get ready for a transition of this magnitude. And so I think the final thing I'll say in opening is that people should be aware, whether you're a space person or you're just getting into the industry or maybe you've been around for a while, we should all be aware of the magnitude of the shift we're talking about. The International Space Station in many ways has been one of the crowning achievements of NASA's human spaceflight program of the last 30 years. It has been this marvel of international cooperation. It has provided a whole new industry, right? If we think about all the companies that are working on Space Station right now, making money for customers, it's created this whole new ecosystem. And in so many ways, it has really been this fabulous experiment for human spaceflight, for science in space. And what we're talking about is this tectonic shift away from this guaranteed resource to one where it's going to be driven by factors that have nothing to do, perhaps necessarily, with national needs or requirements. It's going to be much more about where's the money and where does it make sense to make money and how can I make money in space? And, NASA, of course, is going to have requirements to do stuff in LEO, but is NASA willing to pay for those requirements? I don't think we know all those answers yet. Or I guess more to the point, if Congress is willing to pay for all of those requirements. So I want to make sure as we're having this discussion that we continue in the forefront of our minds understanding just what a huge change this is going to be for our space industry. And so, I had a boss in Congress that used to say, with chaos comes opportunity. And I think that is certainly true in Congress, but I think it's even more true in the business world. When there's a ton of chaos and change and transformation going on, it really presents a lot of very cool opportunities, I think, for the business community. So I think I'll stop there. And happy to answer questions or have more dialogue. And again, thanks very much for the invitation. And Laura, I'm so excited to be doing this with you. I think this is our first event together on a panel, so I'm excited.
It is. I'm excited as well. And I want to one-up you because I not only think this is the greatest achievement, the ISS being the greatest achievement that NASA has done the past 30 years, it's one of the greatest achievements of humankind in recent years. And in fact, the International Space Station has been nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize for several years. It's never won, obviously, but that's just how monumental this has been, is bringing together, the U.S. and Russia, which were very recently adversaries and still in some ways adversaries, along with several other countries. So this has been a great achievement for humankind.
Yeah.
I'm thrilled you brought that up, Laura. I wanted to ask about that. There's actually a new initiative just in the last few months to try to reinvigorate that Nobel nomination. It's a hashtag Nobel for, the number again, just like ours, ISS. Can you guys talk just a little bit about that qualification and just how you would support that?
Oh, I'm not qualified to talk about Nobel Peace Prize qualifications, but I can say that this has been an effort, because when you think about how do you get two adversarial countries to work together as well as it has, and I myself am writing a book right now where I've been interviewing astronauts, and one of the interviews specifically by my former boss, Greg Johnson, who flew on space station a couple times, he specifically pointed out that he flew with cosmonauts. He was a fighter pilot trained to shoot down Soviets. And he flew with a cosmonaut who was also a fighter pilot trained to shoot down Americans. And they flew together and they made a very strong, unified crew up on space station. And that's just how these things bring us together. Is you could talk about the politics of these intergovernmental relations, and that leads to the Lunar Gateway and how we're working with that, and the Artemis Accords and how we're working with that. But just look at what we've already done and how well that's worked out so far, and how much maybe space can bring us together in the future.
Yeah, like Laura, I don't think I'm qualified to talk about the Nobel process, but I would add also that there are few, from a congressional perspective, there are few national projects that are foreign policy related that are not connected to war that Congress has been directly involved and regularly investing in. We could debate all day about why that is. But at the end of the day, the International Space Station is one of the few foreign policy projects that has had long-term sustained investment from Congress. And rightly so. It's as Laura pointed out, it's one of humanity's greatest achievements, and certainly one of this country's greatest foreign policy achievements. And Laura mentioned the Artemis Accords. I think that's a great example of an offshoot of what we built with the ISS, with the international agreement that the ISS operates off of. We start with that as a base, and we start with here's how we made that work, and then you build on top of that. And I think the Artemis Accords is an excellent example, Gateway being part of that, of where the United States has taken that that base that we developed with the International Space Station and said, hey, what other things could we add on top of that? I guess we'll wait. We'll have to see how successful that is. I know there's a lot of people working very hard on it, but I think that's a great example of where the ISS may continue even after it's gone. The International Space Station's operating agreements and stuff, all of those things, they may continue to add on to what we built there.
Can you go back in time a little bit to how the ISS was created, treaties at the State Department level? How do we get that collaboration going in the first place? And how can that translate to future commercial space stations?
I'll kind of start it off. So, a lot of our interests in working with the Russians on the International Space Station had to do with a foreign policy environment that it doesn't really exist anymore, right? So we had a very specific interest in making sure that other countries during that period of time were investing in peaceful uses of technology. We wanted other countries like Russia to be investing in things like space station hardware, the development of science, civil science, and working with us on projects of mutual interest, as opposed to what the previous, in the period post-World War II, where there was this constant drive to develop technologies that would one-up, the United States, or in the United States case, one-up the Soviets. And we had this opportunity to do a lot of technology and science development in a civil space atmosphere, where we knew what they were doing, they knew what we were doing. We had insight into each other's programs, and I think that built a lot of trust in a place where there wasn't a lot of trust to begin with. And the long-term effects of those decisions early on in the space station program, I think really it changed the way that our countries viewed each other in this, pardon the pun, in this space, right? Like, it changed the way that we thought about how we could work with each other and what types of things we could do together. And I think those effects, they still happen today, right? Laura was talking about the interview with Greg Johnson. I think that kind of way of looking at people that are adversaries but not necessarily enemies is a very different thought process than what we had spent, the end of World War II up until the fall of the Soviet Union, and then of course the post-Soviet era. And that, again, I think that those building blocks have been a really great place for us to start in many ways. So, moving forward, that same foreign policy environment doesn't exist today, right? It's we're in a very different world. Russia and China have made multiple announcements recently about how they're working together, on a lot of various things. Geographically, it makes sense, but it is certainly an interesting development from a foreign policy perspective, that Russia sees that it has more national interest in cooperating with China than it does in cooperating with the United States. There's a lot of reasons for why they may feel that way, but that's a very different environment. So what's the effect of that? I don't know. Maybe the US will end up having a closer relationship with developing space programs, right? The UAE is an excellent example of that, right? The UAE has a ton of cash. They've got a ton of talent, and their whole of government approach to space science and technology is really changing their country in ways that are very positive. I was at the International Space Exploration Forum in Tokyo, I guess it was 3 years ago now, and the UAE's Minister of Education was on a panel, and the minister said that they saw investments in space science and space technology as being a counterterrorism tool for them, because if they're investing in students and young people and building up careers in space and science and tech, then they're not going to go do other things because they've got a future. And that, I thought, was just incredibly insightful. Also a very different world perspective, right? Like, we don't think about those sorts of things in the United States.
Well, we do in places like Scranton, where we're hosting today, where 20% of the youth are not tied to job or school. So people 18 to 25, they're floating and looking for a cause. And if that cause is negative or self-destructive, that can really interfere with where we're going. So I think it does apply. Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's, it'll be interesting to see, to your point, Lee, it'll be interesting to see what what future agreements may exist and what types of things can be built on top of on top of what's already there.
This might be a good time to start talking about the commercial opportunities, because anybody around the country, any around the world, really, including in Scranton, Pennsylvania, or Scranton, yeah. So I think that when you think about the future, it's important not to think about these big intergovernmental agreements, because that is the future for certain things like the Artemis program, but that's not necessarily the future for space stations and outposts in low Earth orbit, because we're seeing a number of companies wanting to build their own space stations. There's a company called Axiom Space that got a grant from NASA, the contract to build modules on the space station that they're going to build up over the rest of the lifespan of the space station, which again is unknown at this point, but at least in the next few years. Then when the space station, it comes time to deorbit, we all assume it's going to be deorbited at some point, that Axiom station is going to break off and become a free flyer. There are several other ideas for free-flying space stations that commercial companies build. There's a company called Bigelow Aerospace that is doing something similar. Unfortunately, they've been sort of inactive for the past year or so. So we're just gonna have to see if they continue to be inactive or if they continue with their space station plans with inflatable space stations. Sierra Nevada Corporation is another one that wants to do inflatable space stations. NanoRocks is a company, I think one of the people spoke yesterday, they want to do repurposing of spent rocket boosters. There's a lot of, dead, empty rocket boosters that are up in orbit right now. And if you want to repurpose them, or in the future fly a rocket booster with the specific purpose of turning it into a space station, people have suggested, although SpaceX has not announced this, that Starship could do the same thing. So there's a number of companies out there that could be located anywhere in any part of the country that are working towards launching or helping to facilitate future commercial space stations. And those can be inherently international. Right now, for example, under a certain law regulation, there's prohibitions that put in place that NASA cannot work directly with China, for example. But NanoRacks is a company that's gone around that because they're a commercial company. So then they have already worked with Chinese universities. So when you think about how do you work internationally, it can be through international partners. It can also be through commercial companies. And when you're thinking about how to then commercialize low Earth orbit in a way that we've not seen before, then you have to figure out, as Jared said, how do you make money? What's the profit there? And so there's a number of avenues that are being explored right now, from, as I mentioned before, pharmaceuticals to the fiber optics and all kinds of different ways that commercial companies are trying to figure out how to make money in space using space stations, space platforms, whether or not they're continuously inhabited or not. Jared had mentioned previously, NASA has certain requirements for commercial space stations. NASA wants to have 2 astronauts in space at all times, and they want to do, I forget the exact number, some number of experiments per year. And so when you think about NASA being then an anchor tenant in a way, we used to have malls, because we still do, where there's an anchor store, right? And that's the envisioned future, is that NASA won't own the space stations. NASA will be an anchor tenant in a space station and then contract out what they need, as NASA then frees up its funds to go outward and look towards cislunar and lunar space and beyond to Mars.
Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Yes, that's actually very true, because we do need to make space more commercial and a little bit less government, because when we think of space, initially we do think of NASA for a lot of people. And when we think of NASA, we do think the government. So that's something that we need to really keep in mind, is making that more accessible for a lot more people. And that's through commercial means.
Can you talk a little bit about, Laura, about the specific goals you address? Pharmaceuticals, the ISS clearly has been a primarily science-based goal for that. So can you talk about some of the different goals that these private companies are talking about when they're talking about expansion beyond just a first go, proving the concept?
Yeah, one that immediately comes to mind because of the topic of this this conference here. You've heard from Justin Kugler, Made in Space, my former NASA colleague yesterday, my CASES colleague, I mean. And so Made in Space Redwire is specifically looking at how to manufacture in space, as are several other companies. And so they started out with this 3D printer in space. And that is a simple little experiment that demonstrated that you don't need to bring every tool up in space. You can print what you need using the raw materials. And that leads to all kinds of opportunities for companies to then get materials, as we saw yesterday with Gary's presentation, get it, use it, make things in space. And it could be small, like a small 3D printer. There's another company out there that's doing 3D printing of tissue in space, like human tissue, for medical needs. Or it could be large scale. And the large scale is what interests not just NASA, but the whole defense arena. So don't think it's just NASA that's funding these things within the United States. The Defense Department is also very much interested in how do you not 3D print necessarily, but how do you assemble large structures in space? Because when you have limitations as to what the fairing size of a rocket is, that means you have to do complex origami, complex folding of whatever you're bringing up. But if you can manufacture in space, and we've done this in some ways for decades now, we assembled the space station through different modulars. And in fact, I think Russia still wants to launch a module up there to this day. So it's not 100% complete yet. So if you have a system where you can build upon structures in space, then you have no limit to what you can accomplish other than funds. Yeah. And that's the big question. Who's paying for it and why? And so for initially, it is going to be largely a government expense, but commercial companies can figure out how to make a profit. Agriculture is another one. I don't know if that was mentioned yesterday or not, but yeah, so that's a big area of how do you make crops resistant, just even mutating crops. There's so many different aspects of the research that can then turn into an actual development that can turn into a product. There's endless possibilities, really. And so my job at CASES was to figure out what some of those possibilities were. But it's even better if you get outside of the space community and you go into other industries that hadn't even thought about using space and get them to think, can you do your work better in space? Can you improve your product? Can you, what can you do? One of my favorite examples was a company that was working on improving their power structures in a remote location. And so a remote location where the power turned off and on quite a bit. Space station goes around the Earth every 90 minutes. So every 45 minutes, it's going from solar power to battery in the power grid. So just thinking out of the box like that, how do you use that space environment to improve the technology, improve your product to then make a profit from it? And I think that we've only just scratched the surface as to what's possible.
Sounds like the benefits of crowdsourcing discussion that we had a couple of months ago, just that if you generalize the topic, there are experts in all different kinds of fields who can who come together and they solve problems, unexpected problems. We brought up, can both of you address a little bit, before we go to the public-private partnership part of the discussion, can you talk a little bit more about how the opportunity for private companies and private space stations can allow collaboration between China and the US and other countries? We have later today Andy Aldrin coming, who has an institute specifically for Chinese and American collaboration when thinking about space. And yet there are these big barriers, a lot of competitiveness, a sort of sense of Cold War. Can you talk a little bit about those benefits of having these opportunities to go around official government processes?
So I'll give a little bit of the perspective from the government side. I think Laura is probably better situated to talk about it from a business perspective. But so I think that the barriers that have been referenced, from a legislative perspective, is really more of a foreign policy decision than it is like a science and tech decision. I don't think that, so I'll use Congressman Wolf's the much maligned wolf language in the CJS bill. The original purpose for that was that Congressman Wolf was believed very strongly that China should not benefit from cooperation with NASA while committing gross human rights abuses, right? So I think it's important to keep that in context. Like, it's not as if Frank Wolf was like, well, I hate Chinese people, so I don't want us to cooperate with Chinese people. It's not about that, right? It's about the fact that China was, is, and probably will continue to commit gross human rights abuses of all various kinds. So whether or not you agree that his ability to create that barrier was his little corner of the world that he was able to try and affect that change, I guess we could debate the merits of that. But I do think it's important for us to remember that was the motivation behind this. Now, when companies are looking at doing this, the US interest in a company's interaction with China is about protecting our national interest to ensure that the technology and the science that is done in this country as a direct benefit of our investments as a nation into those sciences and technologies is not co-opted by a government that does not have our same interests in mind. There are lots of ways you can do that. I think NanoRacks, Laura mentioned NanoRacks as a great example, right? They had very specific parameters for how they were interacting with their customer. They did a lot of legwork to make sure that the science was not taken advantage of. There were a lot of safety things in place to make sure that was done in the correct way. And I think, it's of course not uncommon for American companies to sell products to Chinese consumers. It has been a long-standing goal of the US policy that China become a larger consumer of US goods and services, and that, so that we can kind of get this disparity that we have going on with manufacturing more on an equal footing. So that is not an uncommon goal, and it is one that I think everybody shares. What we need to do is find a way to walk that line in space, where we can cooperate on tech development and science development, but do so in a way that protects our national interests and does not demonstrate in any way any sort of implicit endorsement of the government's behavior, especially towards suspect class persons, right? Like that I think is a goal that that just humanity should share. And when we talk about working with China in, for example, like doing lunar exploration or doing, Mars exploration or any type of like human exploration, it's important for us to be the ones writing the rules. It's important for us to be the ones that are defining the parameters of what our values are going to be as we move deeper into space, if we're going to cooperate, because Scott Pace is very fond of saying, my former boss, is very fond of saying that I don't care if China's on the moon. Like, it doesn't matter if China's on the moon. It doesn't matter if China's in low Earth orbit. Like, if China wants to go do those things, then, and that's in China's national interest, then they're going to go do them. What I don't want is for them to be there without me there, because then they're the ones setting the terms. They're the ones writing the rules. And so what I think we've got to do is kind of find what that line is and walk that line in a way that benefits our long-term national interests, and make sure that we have that we are benefiting from that relationship. And hopefully slowly, probably too slowly, helping to bring China along in the conversation to where they're thinking more about our values than perhaps values that they had been utilizing in the past. So I know that's a very U.S.-centric way of looking at it, but I'm a U.S. policymaker, so what do you want?
It's not just U.S., I think, and I'm excited to hear Laura's viewpoint on the business side, but these are themes that I've heard. And when I was preparing for my talk on art and sport in space, performing artists were talking about how they wanted the U.S. to be writing the rules and setting the norms for how things go forward rather than some other entities. And so I think there's, even in unexpected places, you're hearing those themes.
Yeah, I'd agree with Jared, actually. I think that it's very important to cautiously and methodically move forward on this path, whether or not you are government or commercial or even an individual. And so business doesn't get free rein here. There's always, there's ITAR restrictions, for example. There's different regulations put in place so that it protects national security interests and it protects businesses. And we do have to be careful, not just with the human rights violations with China, but also the cybersecurity and IP issues. So there's different things that businesses are very much aware of when they're working with not just China, but other countries. But China in particular is one to talk about because as early as this month, China wants to start launching its own space station. It had a small temporary space station previously, and now it wants to create a more permanent space station this year and next, starting with launches as early as this month. And China has already been in contact with international partners. Some of them are even partners of the United States. So when, for example, the European Space Agency and those countries, when they think about who they're going to partner with in low Earth orbit and beyond, they now have to think, yeah, we want to partner with the United States, but we also have this opportunity to partner with China. And how do we work together or not with the partners and with China? And, there's definitely a lot of opportunity there for diplomacy, but one does have to be very cautious when moving forward because of the delicacies of the human rights violations and genocide that's going on right now. No doubt about that. If you're a business person, you want to act in the best interest of your business. And that can be both making a profit and also how that looks. So for example, I can think off the top of my head, Virgin Galactic backed out of financing with Saudi Arabia because of a human rights violation there. And so it's not unheard of that space companies think about these things and how it might look to the outside world, in addition to the fact that they want to make a profit in space. When you're thinking about moving forward as a commercial company, and again, commercial company can be based anywhere. It could be based in Scranton as well as, a lot of them are in Houston, Texas right now, Florida. There's just so many different places and opportunities that can open up. And the beauty of it being international is that there are different expertise around the world and also different ways to partner with those government entities to bring in different opportunities that might not have occurred previously. We talked about the UAE, for example. They are full force forward, running forward as much as they can to try to get themselves to be a growing space power. India is another one. India actually wants to create their own space station. Whether or not they have the funds to do it in the future, we'll see. But they have announced that they want to do their own space station as well. Even Russia has said that they want to, although I don't know if they're ever going to get the funds. They are kind of declining when it comes to space funding. But there's all kinds of emerging space powers that want to get in on this game, and they want to both partner with established players like the United States, but also partner with commercial companies, because especially the more I don't know if progressive is the right word, but the ones who are forward thinking, they know that commercial space is the future. You have uncertainty when it comes to government funding. And a space station, if you go look at the history, you asked about the history, it was almost not funded at all. It was one vote. It was Representative John Lewis, who passed away recently. So there was actually a story published within the past year about this, reminiscing about he was the one vote that cast yes to have funding for a space station to even begin. So when it comes to government funding, nothing is completely guaranteed. But if you have means of creating your own profit in space, then that's, not to say business is guaranteed, it's definitely not. But there's a balance there, a risk balance, and you have to figure out how to work that out if you're a company and you want to start working in space.
I think there's probably also, sorry, I just wanted to add one thing, Lee. So when we're talking about doing business with China, I think there's two things that we always need to keep at the forefront of our mind. And that is first, the claim that there is a truly private company in China of any kind in any industry is a fairly dubious claim. And we could talk all day about that and what that means and what constitutes a private entity in a communist state, but like that's just a fact, right? Like there whether or not there is any truly private company in China is probably a dubious claim. Number one. And number two, that China has a long history in all kinds of activities of basically giving away free services to foreign to other countries and foreign companies as a way to entice them into a relationship. And then once they're in that relationship and they are completely tied to that capability or that business model, then they start extracting a price. And so when you're that's part of what I mean when I say like, and I think Laura hit it perfectly, like doing it methodically, thinking through what are the second and third order effects, like what are the things that are going to come next down the road that I can't see right now in doing business with China or a Chinese company. So I think those two things are super important just to keep in the forefront of our mind. And I think as long as you go into these things with eyes wide open and knowing that like when I do these sorts of things, that there are these potential other issues that are going to come along with it. As long as you do that and you're thinking about what your values are and how they may be in conflict with those with Chinese values, then I think you've got probably a much better shot at being successful.
Great. Well, certainly have a lot more. We could go another hour on that train, but I do want to talk about Foundation for the Future's plans for the Space Act, Space Cooperation Act of 2021. It trying to create a public-private partnership to help support space infrastructure development, combination of commercial and government activity. So can you both address from your different perspectives how you see that benefiting the development of commercial space stations?
I'm really glad you brought that up. This is essential. And I know Jared has a lot to talk about this as well, but I wanted to start off saying that we need to think about space as a critical infrastructure. We take space for granted in our daily lives. It is ingrained in our modern society. Communications, GPS, and precise timing, and weather, and space is critical infrastructure, and we need to fund it that way. And so when you're thinking about funding for the future, you need to think about low Earth orbit as being a critical infrastructure, both in terms of satellites and in terms of human space presence. And we need to start funding it that way. And so Congress to the past two fiscal years has not yet seen this and funded LEO commercialization is what NASA calls it, to the point where NASA has asked them to. So NASA has this plan. Maybe they haven't detailed it as well as they should, but they have this plan for how to move forward with the critical infrastructure of moving past space station and preparing for commercial space stations. And to the date, Congress has yet to actually fully fund that. They've only funded about 10% of what NASA has asked for. And Congress needs to really get on board, and maybe NASA is at fault too, to really prove that this is critical infrastructure that we really need to plan for now, because it takes a long time for companies to actually build things and to launch things. We know how delayed that can be. So unless we want a gap, like we saw the gap, Jared mentioned how devastated, and I lived in Florida as well, how devastated Florida was, the gap between Space Shuttle and Crew Dragon. We don't want that gap between International Space Station and what comes next. So we need to start planning and funding it now.
Yeah, so I guess I'm going to take this from a little bit different perspective. So the public-private partnership idea like everything these days seems to be a public-private partnership. It is like it's like the buzzwords that everybody wants to hear. Everybody seems to think like, hey, if you're doing a public-private partnership, like it's 100% it's going to be good. I think we need to probably spend a little bit of time as a community, as the space industry, thinking through what do we mean when we say public-private partnership. Do we really mean that we just want to set up a quasi-governmental corporation that is going to fund projects that we think are important, and then maybe some companies will put in money themselves? Do we mean that we need to have a hard 50-50, that like it's a dollar for dollar match, right? Like I worked in the Florida government, and when we would pass like infrastructure bills in Florida, we had a matching thing. Like if the county wanted to put in a certain number of dollars, the state would match those dollars, like $1.25 for every dollar they did, or something like that. The federal government does a very similar thing, right? Like the federal government will say to the states, we famously do this with Medicaid. For every dollar that you put in, the federal government puts X number of dollars as well. So do we mean it that way? I think there's a lot of different ways from a public policy perspective that you can take that conversation. The most recent examples of this, I think, are probably commercial cargo and commercial crew. I think commercial cargo has been quoted on the order of a 50-50, that the providers did about 50% of the development costs themselves. And that for some it's a little bit more. I think Sierra Nevada is probably more than 50%. I think Orbital ATK's original plan was probably less than 50% because they had to catch up after rocket plane Kistler got booted out of the competition. So it like fluctuates, but I think it's basically like 50-50 split. I think commercial crew was probably more on the order of like 80-20 because it's just so much more complex. And so when we think about private space stations, and Laura mentioned, NASA wants to have 2 astronauts in LEO like continuously. So peace, okay, like I get it, but long-term sustained eclipse in LEO is very expensive. It is very hard to do, and if we're going to have astronauts in low Earth orbit on private space stations for long periods of time, the investment into ecosystems that are capable of handling that type of environment is very expensive. And so we just need to go into it understanding that if the businesses don't have a closed business model for how they're going to support sustained investment in an ecosystem that can last for 6 months, then NASA's going to have to pay for the business case that doesn't close. If there is a business out there that thinks that it's got a good case for having a paying customer on the space station for a long period of time, or maybe they've got like a pharmaceutical company that says, we're willing to pay your astronaut for all of their time to run all of our experiments in microgravity and do this research for us. And then maybe the business case closes like that, right? So maybe it's not a NASA astronaut. Maybe the business case closes because their private astronaut is being paid for, all of this astronaut time and training and, all that sort of stuff. But is that a public-private partnership? I don't know. I guess yes, in a lot of ways it is. But from a public policy perspective, I think that we probably all need to spend a little bit of time thinking about what do we think is our nation's national interest in paying for the development of these capabilities, and does that line up with the business case? Mm-hmm. In places where it does, then I think that's great and we should do that. In places where it doesn't, then maybe that really is more of something like a private capability that NASA could purchase a service from. I think there's a place for all of those different types. I think in some cases, NASA has a great reason to spend a lot of money on a capability. Like we see them, they do that all the time. Our country makes those trade-offs all the time. In other cases, I think it probably makes more sense for NASA to just be a customer of the service. And there is a place for all of those things. And we need to be more intellectually rigorous about how we make those decisions, as opposed to, kind of throwing everything under the public-private partnership umbrella and saying, okay, everything's going to be a PPP. Sorry, that's a little bit of a soapbox for me, but I think that's because I tragically had to deal with these things in legislation, and legislation is so black and white. It's either this thing or it's this thing. You can't have it be both. Finding a way to split those things and give us those shades of gray and that flexibility it's a tough public policy problem. So I love that we've got an organization that is interested in standing up this idea and wants to debate the policy. Like, I think it's great. I really wish I had something like this to look at when I was on the Hill. So I think it's great.
Thank you. Laura, do you have any closing comments? We're at the end of our time and just want to give you one more opportunity.
Yeah, I'm surprised that it didn't mention it yet, but Jared brought up private astronauts. And I think it's important to at least discuss that a little bit, in that we're not just talking about space tourists who are going to go up there and party and look out the window. The private astronauts who have gone to space station, and there have been 7, one went up twice with a company called Space Adventures, and ones that are going to go up in the future through Axiom Space and through hopefully in the future through other companies as well. Axiom is contracting with SpaceX. These people are doing real science or business. Richard Garriott, for example, he is the son of astronaut Owen Garriott, and he is one of the founders, in a sense, of commercial space. He flew, and he said that he, made some money. He didn't make up the entire bill that he had to pay to go up to space, but he made money while going up there. And so there's an opportunity there for commercial companies to then fly their own private astronauts or customers that they are, for example, Axiom Space has contracted an Israeli private astronaut to fly on their first mission. So it could be international in that sense, and it could be commercial, and it could be someone just having fun. But the chances are when they're going and having fun, they're also going to do some really great science or outreach or something that's beneficial to the world. So I think it's important to note people get this misimpression about quote unquote space tourism. But it's really just another way to get astronauts up there. And when we're talking about the definition of astronauts, I'd say that anybody who's on a space station is an astronaut, right? That's just my personal definition. I think most people would agree. And we're going to have to think about this in the future of how more and more and more people are going to be able to fly suborbitally, maybe, but also orbitally. That starting this year, hopefully, with the Inspiration 4 mission. And so it's another way of shifting our thinking to who are these people who are going to be in space, and what are they going to represent, and what are they going to do, and what benefit can they have for both humanity and whatever company they're flying with.
Jared, if you have any closing remarks.
I don't. I was just saying thank you for the invitation. Thank you to my fellow panelists, Laura. If anybody has any follow-up questions, the link to our firm's website is there. You can also find me on Twitter at @space_Jared, and be happy to have follow-up conversations. So thanks very much.
Yeah, if you can both put your LinkedIn information and your website credentials on the chat so we can continue networking, that would be amazing. Thank you so much.